Hello world, I'm here today I'm putting it in the Song and the Story series, but it's not really the Song and the Story. It's a story of Band-Aid as I witnessed it. And I was just a, pretty insignificant 16-year-old at the time, and it was vying for competition amongst all kinds of other things that were going on in my life at the time, school and O levels and whatever else at the time. So but I do have certain very key memories of it, some of which I think might be of interest to the wider public on YouTube. So it's been 40 years since Michael Burke's original report, first broadcast 23rd October 1984, went on our screens. The result from the public was just absolute guttural. We need to do something really immediately. I remember the following week's Smash Hits edition, which basically I can remember a particular letter to black type, which was the letters page, which stood out to me, although there were loads of letters about it, but this one particularly stood out to me because it ended up with, if the starving children in Africa had been fully paid up members of the Labour Party, then pop stars like Paul Weller and Billy Bragg might even see their way to care. So there was this need, there was this immediate reaction from the public. On the 23rd of October 1984, Bob Geldof got home from work about 6 p.m. Now, Bob Geldof was the lead singer of the Boomtown Rats. The Boomtown Rats, I think, were formed around about 75, 76. I remember they ripped up famously a picture of John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John on top of the pops when one of their singles got to number one. I think it might have been Rat Trap. But yeah, they had a string of hit singles, but by 1984 they were pretty washed up. And he'd been trying to hawk the new Boomtown Rats music to record companies who were having none of it. And he got home to Paulie Yates being his wife. She was presenter of the trendiest pop music show on TV at the time, which was a programme on Channel 4 called The Tube. She was at home, they had their little daughter, turned on the news, and there was this Ethiopian famine report. Paulie Yates couldn't stand it. She took her little daughter upstairs. He carried on watching it, didn't really talk much about it that evening. But the following day, she had to go up to Newcastle where the Tube was being filmed. There was a bowl on the table and the note in it said, anyone who visits this house puts a fiver in. A fiver was a lot of money in those days. It's like, putting 20, 25 pound in now. His idea really was that, £5, yeah, great, whatever. And, their house was a DOS, basically, for people sleeping on the lounge floor and stuff like that, all his pop star mates and stuff. So not a bad idea, but not enough, he thought. And he wanted to do something, but the Boomtown Rats were washed up. The only people who could do something were the people that were current at the time. The Whams, Durans, Spandaus, Paul Youngs, people like that were, the new face of pop music. And he got on the phone to Midge Ure, who was a mate of his who happened to be working with Paulie Yates that weekend on her show, and they got this thing together. Bob Geldof had this song that even the rest of the Boomtown Rats rejected. You can't really claim that Do They Know It's Christmas is an absolute work of art. It isn't. They wouldn't say it's a work of art. It was just something that was put together in a hurry against, as I hope I've tried to sort of convey to you, this very urgent sense of something needs to be done this minute. The politicians will not do it for you. That will, come to play a bit later on as I talk about this. So we all got the news of that. Shortly after I read that letter in Smash Hits, I saw a report on telly about how the pop stars were getting together to make this record. And they literally had 24 hours All right. Midge had agreed to co-write this song. Bob Geldof, as I say, had a few lines of a song that even got rejected by the Boomtown Rats, who themselves were being rejected. Midge spent a few days in his home studio cobbling together a backing track. I need to talk about some unsung heroes of that backing track. Bob Geldof was phoning round people, trying to put the last finishing touches to the lyrics. And within a few days, they'd got together, Trevor Horn and his wife Jill Sinclair, who ran Psalm West Studios in London, in West London. So Trevor Horn has agreed 24 hours of studio time. So Trevor Horn made a point, which you'll see if you watch the making of Live Aid, which is on YouTube, and I think it's on the BBC iPlayer as well, that he was £85 an hour. That's £270.59. All the musicians on the record, as I say, Midge, for example, didn't charge anything. All of the singers didn't charge anything. None of the distributors charged anything. So basically, the price of this single, which was something like £1.10, I can't remember exactly how much singles were at the end of 1984. I do remember that they did put, an exact price on the copy of that single when they were talking about this thing on the news. And it was around about £1.10. So basically everybody gave their services for free. And it was, virtually a completely free record to produce, to get to the stores, to sell. None of the stores were charging anything for selling it. Basically, it was a complete freebie. The press even gave centre spread pages of newspapers to this. It was going to be a big seller, whatever. But, they got behind it absolutely, completely. And Bob Geldof said that, we might make £1 million. We're hoping to make £1 million out of it that we can donate to famine relief. And they made about, I think within the first couple of weeks, definitely Christmas #1. And it made about 6 million, I think, just in this country in that very, very short time, which was obviously very encouraging. But the press, being the press, as they are, suddenly decided to start picking holes in things. They say it costs £1.10. But I've been round shops and it's been £1.15 and it's been £1.20 and it's supposed to be £1.10. Because this is the way the press are. They really are just, a lot of them basically just get their ideas straight out of the gutter. We wouldn't have noticed. I think, most people realised that back in the 80s, it wasn't 1967 anymore. In 1967, records in the UK had this label that I've talked about before, which is something about sold in the UK subject to price lists and whatever. So basically the record company controlled how much those singles went out for, and EMI were famous for putting it on their records. And that's how you've got a first edition Beatles record, because it's got sold in the UK all over the centre of the label. They didn't price fix in the 80s. You went from one store, Woolworths maybe, to WH Smith's 2 doors down, and each of them there was, maybe a couple of pennies difference on the price of albums or singles, maybe the odd sort of 50p, 20p difference maybe. And that's how we lived in those days. So Band-Aid being a few pence different from shop to shop was nothing to us. And my mate, his father owned Magic Music in Clacton High Street at the time. And I can remember there being a notice in the shop, because they were tiny, a little independent store. They mainly sold keyboards and sheet music, but they also had a record department as well. The records were a bit more expensive because they were a tiny independent store. They didn't have the marketing clout that Woolworths in particular had. Woolworths could have sold it for £1.10 because that was the going rate, or roughly the going rate for a single at the time. But Port Magic Music and the likes of other shops such as Andy's Records and stuff like that, every town had dozens of record shops. Even Clacton, I can name 5 or 6 shops in just around and about Clacton's main shopping streets, and they were all competing with one another. And it was difficult enough without the press then raising this issue that because they'd said it cost £1.10 or whatever they said it costs, and some record shops were selling it 5p or 10p more. So, where was the extra 10p going? My mate's dad put up a notice at the record counter which said, "We are aware that our singles are more expensive than £1.10 and that Band-Aid is being advertised for £1.10. If you want the single for £1.10, you can have it for £1.10. If you think it's worth the £1.20 that we charge, then please put the extra 10p into this jar and it will go to Band-Aid." So yeah, there was that little bit of unpleasantness about it. But by and large, this record went on in its first few weeks to raise absolutely millions for famine relief. We can't let the UK government off the hook. It was led by a rather unpleasant lady called Margaret Thatcher. She and her government decided to claim the VAT from the record. Now, VAT in the UK stands for value added tax. Basically, there are a few items that you can buy in shops or online or whatever which are not subject to VAT. Food, for example, is not subject to VAT. I don't think books are. Children's clothes, for example, I think are not subject to VAT. But most of everything else is inclusive of VAT. It's not like going shopping in America where you go around the store, you look at the prices. It might be that this t-shirt is $18.99, and then when you get it to the counter, they then add the tax on. So it might be more like $22 or something like that, depending on the rate of tax for that state. It's not like that. Basically, VAT is something that is shown inclusive on the price tag, so that when you take it to the counter and pay for it, that is the price you pay, and that includes a percentage going off to the government. The government were taking their VAT from Do They Know It's Christmas. It took quite a while. It took throughout most of 1985 for Bob Geldof and the Band-Aid Trust to try and persuade Margaret Thatcher to release that VAT. In the end, what they did was made a donation, I think in the middle of 1985, just after Live Aid. I think, they would have felt browbeaten into doing it, because the whole thing about the Band-Aid record was that we don't think the politicians are going to act with the kind of urgency that this situation demands. Therefore, we have to do something. So Thatcher was kind of browbeaten into it because Band-Aid had made her look like the big bad wolf. She gave a donation, or the government gave a donation to the Band-Aid Trust or whatever, or to famine relief, not even to Band-Aid, but to famine relief, the equivalent of which was, the amount of VAT that they'd taken from the Band-Aid single. Now, going back to this song, I think there are some completely unsung heroes. Now, mid-year, when you watch the making of Band-Aid, it is quite clear who is in the driving seat, who is the actual musical genius that is getting this to work. An absolute gem of a bloke by what you see of him there, and a genius. But behind his genius lies somebody else. And these people, again, by the press, who tried to make as much trouble as they possibly could. They can't see something good without making trouble about it. But they tried to create this bad feeling between Bob Geldof, Midyear, and Tears for Fears. It really wasn't there. I think it came about because A, they're not in the Band-Aid video, neither did they perform at Live Aid. They were in the middle of a 12-month tour. I think possibly because Tears for Fears took so long to put out records and they were constantly missing deadlines, when they released an LP called Songs of the Big Chair towards the end of 1984, they were heavily committed to touring it, and they were in the middle of a 12-month tour. Live Aid weekend happened to occur on Tears for Fears' only weekend off in months, and they naturally did not want to give that up. But back in November 1984, when Midyear was writing this record, the very first notes that you hear, that particularly sort of characteristic drum, that kind of, I'm sure that this is part of it as well, there's kind of a breathy, sort of deep choir note that comes in every sort of few beats or so. It doesn't quite match the key of the rest of the record. It's a little bit off, but that is because Midyear used the first few beats of the Tears for Fears song, The Hurting, the opening track from their 1983 LP, which, as I say, had taken ages to make. But there we go. Those very first few notes are a slowed down sample of Tears for Fears, The Hurting. I'll put links in the description to Do They Know It's Christmas and to The Hurting, and you'll see how similar they are. That sample is not just something that you just hope nobody recognises and you might get away with using it. So constructing that sample, and that sample goes across the whole of that first verse, I think, more or less until we get to Throw Your Arms Around the World at Christmas Time, and then it kind of stops. But that would have required clearance from Tears for Fears' record company. Tears for Fears would have had to have foregone their royalties from the use of that. Normally, you use a sample, you pay for it, as happens nowadays. A tiny nth of a proportion of the money that record raises goes to the owner of that sample. Well, Tears for Fears will have foregone that. So having made this great big scenario where Tears for Fears were somehow the villains behind this thing, those very first notes are Tears for Fears. They didn't perform at Live Aid. They were billed to have performed at Live Aid. Somebody overlooked asking them, but naturally assumed they would perform, and so their names went down in the publicity. And they were a bit annoyed about it because, as I say, they did not want to give up their weekend off. However, they did give the proceeds to various different shows, including shows in London, to the Band-Aid Trust. So it's not like Tears for Fears was somehow unsupportive. And in 1986, by which time Band-Aid, the single, had been released in 1984, and again a year later in 1985, and now in summer of 1986, we were all being encouraged. I'm afraid I didn't do this, I can't run a step, but we had to do sport aid, go round basically with our sponsor forms, getting people to sponsor us, to run 5 kilometres in aid of Band-Aid Trust. Whatever. There was a Sport Aid record released, and guess whose record it was? It was Tears for Fears. Everybody wants to, it used to be Everybody Wants to Rule the World, but hey, they changed it to Everybody Wants to Run the World, which I suppose could take on the same meaning as rule, run the world, whatever. Everybody wants to rule the world, everybody wants to run the world. But because we were having this running thing, yes. I will shut up now. Right. So really, for me, the legacy of Band Aid and Do They Know It's Christmas was obviously Live Aid. Live Aid, July the 13th, 1985. It was a boiling hot day, as I remember. I can remember, obviously turning the telly on at home and watching it, then going around my mates and watching it, going into town and it's on, you're standing outside Curry's and every TV in the display has got Live Aid on it, going into, as I say, my mate's record shop and they're watching it in there. And, it was, apart from it being a fantastic pop concert, it was just a fantastic feeling of togetherness. And of course, as the evening wore on, then we suddenly saw the Cars, Who's Going to Drive You Home, against more footage of this famine. And that, got the phones ringing even more. Bob Geldof went on telly, did an interview, and the interviewer said, yes, of course, yes, the phone number is, and the address is, and Bob said, give out the phone number. And of course, this interviewer had been told, give out the address to write to with your checks. And Bob goes, fuck the address, here's the phone number. That Bob Geldof euphemised that as, I let out a word, and actually one of Paulie Yates, Paulie Yates was behind the scenes another great driving force of this project. And one of the things that she instigated in her house, as well as the £5 for everyone who visits this house, it was, there's a swear jar as well. So Bob actually swearing on the telly, for him that would have been a cardinal sin. And I think Paulie Yates must have said, right, that's a tenner in the swear jar now, kind of thing. So Live Aid, it was just, an absolutely, unforgettable day. Even if, like me, you were just soaking it up at home and round your mate's house. I remember walking through W.H. Smith's a week or so later, and there is Smash Hits. There's this great big cover of Bob Geldof. I was there with my mate walking through, and he pokes me in the arm and says, he did it! Because that was the big headline of Smash Hits. He did it, and it really was an absolutely amazing feeling. And yeah, I will leave you there. Remember to like, subscribe, share if you dare. Please hit the notification bell so that you get notified. This probably won't be my last video before Christmas. I need to get some trees up and things like that, which I haven't done yet. But if this really is the last time I see you before Christmas, please have a nice one. All right, see you later. Bye-bye. What is true beyond any shadow of doubt is that had we not done this 40 years ago, there would be many hundreds of thousands of people who would not be alive today because of this small pop effort. That's mad, isn't it? Mad and awful. What a stupid way to run the world.